In the year 1324, a caravan crossed the Sahara Desert carrying gold that most European kingdoms had ever seen in a single lifetime. At its center rode a king so wealthy that his journey alone crashed an economy for over a decade. This was not Rome, this was not Persia, this was Mali, and history nearly forgot it. Before this empire is revealed in full, understand this. What follows is not legend, it is documented fact, recorded by Arab historians, European mapmakers, and the ruins still standing today. If this story moves you, subscribe now, because the empires history left behind deserve to be remembered before they're lost again. Long before Mansa Musa became a name whispered across continents, the land along the Niger River was already a battlefield of ambition. The old Ghana Empire, once the dominant power of West Africa, had weakened under the pressure of invasions, drought, and the erosion of its trade networks. Into this vacuum stepped a new power, the Mali Empire, forged not in peace but in war. Its founder was Sundiata Keita, a prince born into the Keita clade of the Mandinka people in the early 1200s. According to oral tradition preserved by griots and later corroborated by Arab chroniclers, Sundiata faced a difficult childhood, exiled from his homeland after political rivals seized power. But exile did not end him, it hardened him. He gathered allies from neighboring kingdoms, built a coalition of warriors, and prepared to reclaim what had been taken. The defining moment came in 1235 at the Battle of Kirina. Sundiata's forces clashed with the army of Sumanguru Kante, the ruler who had usurped the Mandinka throne and terrorized the region with a brutal, centralized grip on power. The battle was fierce, fought with cavalry, spears, and iron-forged weapons across the plains of what is now Mali. When the dust settled, Sundiata stood victorious. Sumanguru was defeated, and a new order rose from the wreckage of war. Following his victory, Sundiata did something remarkable for the era. He didn't simply declare himself ruler by force. He convened a gathering of clan leaders and warriors, later remembered as the Kurukan Fuga Assembly, where a framework of governance was established. Some historians consider this one of the earliest constitutions in world history, outlining the division of power, the rights of different clans, and the rules that would guide the empire for generations. From this foundation, the Mali Empire was born, and it would not stay small for long. What made Mali extraordinary wasn't just its military strength, it was geography and timing. The empire sat directly along the trans-Saharan trade routes, the arteries connecting West Africa to North Africa, and from there to the Mediterranean world and beyond. Two resources moved along these routes in staggering quantities: gold and salt. Gold came from the mines of Bambouk, Bouré, and later Akan territories to the south, regions so rich in deposits that medieval geographers described West Africa as a land where gold grew like plants. Salt, mined from deposits at Tagaza in the Sahara, was just as valuable, often traded pound for pound with gold in regions where salt was scarce but essential for survival and food preservation. Mali's rulers understood something critical. Control the trade routes, and you control the wealth of an entire trading world. Cities like Timbuktu, Gao, and Djenné grew from trading posts into major economic and intellectual centers, taxed and protected by the empire's administration. Merchants moving through Mali paid tribute, and in return, they received relative safety and infrastructure that few other regions in the medieval world could offer. By some historical estimates, at its height, Mali may have controlled as much as half of the world's gold supply passing through international trade. To put that into perspective, while European kingdoms like England and France were consumed by feudal wars, plague, and fractured, inconsistent currencies, Mali was operating one of the most gold-rich economies on the planet.
And then came the ruler who would make this wealth impossible to ignore. Mansa Musa ascended to the throne in the early 1300s, inheriting an empire already vast and prosperous. But it was his 1324 pilgrimage to Mecca that transformed him from a regional ruler into a global legend. Arab historians who documented the journey, most notably al-Umari, wrote accounts based on interviews with people in Cairo who witnessed the caravan firsthand. The numbers, even accounting for exaggeration common in medieval accounts, are staggering. Estimates suggest Mansa Musa traveled with a retinue of thousands. Some accounts claim as many as 60,000 people, including soldiers, officials, and enslaved attendants, alongside a train of camels carrying hundreds of pounds of gold. This was not merely a religious journey, it was a demonstration of imperial power, moving across thousands of miles of desert and foreign territory. Along the route, Mansa Musa distributed gold generously to the poor, to local rulers, to mosques and institutions he passed. When his caravan reached Cairo, then one of the wealthiest and most sophisticated cities in the world, the sheer volume of gold he spent and gave away flooded the local market. The result was an economic shockwave. The value of gold in Cairo dropped so sharply that, according to multiple historical accounts, it took the Egyptian economy over a decade to recover its former exchange value. A single foreign ruler passing through on a religious pilgrimage had destabilized the currency of one of the era's dominant economic powers. No European monarch of that period had ever demonstrated wealth on a comparable scale during a single journey.
News of Mansa Musa's wealth spread rapidly through Arab trade networks and eventually into Europe. By 1375, cartographers in Spain produced the Catalan Atlas, one of the most significant maps of the medieval world. On it, Mansa Musa is depicted seated on a throne holding a golden orb and scepter, with the inscription identifying him as the richest and most noble ruler in the entire region. For the first time, a West African empire was placed firmly on the map of global power, quite literally. But Mali's wealth was never only about gold. It was about what that wealth built. Timbuktu, often mischaracterized in modern imagination as a mythical or exaggerated place, was very real, a thriving center of trade, religion, and scholarship. Under Mali's rule, and especially during and after Mansa Musa's reign, the city became home to the Sankore Madrasa, part of what functioned as a university system centuries before many European institutions reached comparable scale. Scholars traveled to Timbuktu from across the Islamic world to study law, astronomy, medicine, and theology. Manuscripts were produced, copied, and traded. Some estimates suggest the libraries of Timbuktu held well over 100,000 manuscripts at their peak, covering subjects ranging from religious jurisprudence to mathematics and the natural sciences. Many of these manuscripts survive today, preserved by families in Mali, and now protected through international preservation efforts after being threatened during conflict in the region in recent decades. This was an empire where wealth funded knowledge, not just monuments. While literacy rates in much of medieval Europe remained low outside the clergy and nobility, Timbuktu cultivated a class of scholars, judges, and religious leaders whose work extended Mali's influence far beyond its physical borders. Yet an empire of this size and wealth did not hold its position through trade and scholarship alone. It held its position through military strength. Mali's army was structured around a core of cavalry, horses being both a symbol of status and a tactical advantage across the open savanna terrain of West Africa. Alongside cavalry, the empire fielded infantry armed with iron weapons, and crucially, a river-based naval force operating war canoes along the Niger River, used to move troops, control river trade, and project power into territories that would have been difficult to reach by land alone. This military structure allowed Mali to maintain control over a vast network of vassal states and tributary provinces, stretching from the Atlantic coast in the west to territories near modern-day Niger in the east. At its height, Historians estimate Mali's territory rivaled or exceeded the combined size of several Western European kingdoms of the same era. Provincial governors, often drawn from trusted families or military commanders, administered these regions and ensured tribute in gold, goods, and manpower flowed back to the imperial center.
Warfare was a constant undercurrent of maintaining this empire. Rebellions among vassal states, conflicts over succession, and the need to defend lucrative trade routes from rival powers meant Mali's rulers could never fully rest on accumulated wealth. Every gold caravan that moved safely across the Sahara did so because of the military infrastructure protecting it. For over a century, that infrastructure held, but no empire is immune to the forces that eventually eroded from within. After Mansa Musa's death, likely in the mid-1300s, Mali entered a prolonged period of succession disputes. Unlike the relatively stable transfer of power under Sundiata's dynasty in earlier generations, later rulers faced internal power struggles, rebellions from provincial leaders, and growing pressure from rising regional powers. The most significant of these emerging threats was the Songhai Empire, centered around the city of Gao, which had once been a vassal territory under Mali's control. Through the 1400s, Songhai steadily broke away from Malian authority. Under leaders like Sunni Ali in the latter half of the 15th century, Songhai expanded aggressively, absorbing territories that had once paid tribute to Mali, including, eventually, Timbuktu itself. As Songhai's power grew, Mali's grip loosened province by province. Trade routes that once funneled wealth directly into Mali's imperial treasury began shifting toward Songhai's growing sphere of control. Internal fragmentation compounded the problem. Regional rulers within Mali increasingly acted with independence, some effectively operating as autonomous states while nominally still under Malian authority. By the 16th century, the Mali Empire that had once dazzled the medieval world had shrunk dramatically, reduced to a smaller kingdom clinging to its core territories, while the empires it once dominated the region were now controlled by Songhai. Mali persisted in some diminished form for generations afterward, but its era as a global economic superpower had ended. Songhai itself would later fall in 1591, defeated by Moroccan forces wielding gunpowder weapons at the Battle of Tondibi, a stark demonstration of how firearms were beginning to reshape warfare and power across the world. The fall of Songhai marked the definitive end of the great trans-Saharan trading empires that had defined West African power for over 3 centuries, with Mali's own legacy already fading into the background by that point. What followed in the centuries after was not just political decline, but historical erasure. As European colonial powers expanded into Africa from the 1600s onward, and particularly during the era of the transatlantic slave trade and later colonization in the 1800s and 1900s, narratives about African history were frequently minimized, distorted, or ignored entirely in mainstream historical education, particularly in the West.
The story of an empire that had once destabilized Cairo's economy with its wealth, that had built one of the medieval world's great centers of learning, and that had commanded armies and river fleets across a territory larger than Western Europe, became a footnote, if it was mentioned at all, in history taught to generations of students worldwide. This erasure was not accidental. Colonial-era historians and educators often constructed narratives that portrayed pre-colonial Africa as lacking complex political and economic systems, a framing that conveniently justified colonial expansion and exploitation. The existence of an empire like Mali, sophisticated, wealthy, and internationally recognized in its own era, directly contradicted that narrative.
It has only been in recent decades, through the work of historians, archaeologists, and the preservation efforts surrounding Timbuktu's surviving manuscripts, some of which were smuggled out of Timbuktu for safekeeping during periods of conflict and extremist threats to the city's cultural heritage in the 2010s. What remains today are ruins, preserved manuscripts, the accounts of Arab historians who witnessed Mali's power firsthand, and a map from 1375 that still shows a West African king holding a golden orb, placed deliberately, prominently on the known world of its time. The Mali Empire was not a myth. It was not exaggerated folklore passed down without evidence. It was a documented, internationally recognized superpower of the medieval world, one whose wealth reshaped the economy of Cairo, whose scholars produced knowledge that rivaled the great centers of the Islamic and European worlds, and whose military held together a territory larger than many European kingdoms combined. For centuries, this history sat quietly in manuscripts and oral tradition, overshadowed by the empires of Europe that dominated the history books taught in classrooms worldwide. But the evidence has always existed. The maps existed. The accounts existed. The manuscripts existed. An empire richer than every kingdom in Europe walked the earth, and for far too long, the world simply chose not to look. If this story of Mali's forgotten power moved you, don't let it end here. Subscribe now, because there are more empires history tried to erase, and they deserve to be remembered too. Drop a comment below with which empire should be uncovered next, because the truth doesn't disappear. It just waits for someone to tell it again.